the Australian e-Research Infrastructure to 2012 and Beyond, sponsored by the Department of Innovation, Industry, Science and Research. My name is Ron Sandland. I'm your chairman for today. I'm standing in for Claire McLaughlin. I look quite a bit like Claire, so they thought maybe I'd be a good substitute. And they have asked me. Claire was detained on overseas duties, as many of you will know. So it was a great pleasure for me to agree to chair this forum on a very important topic, e-research infrastructure to 2012 and beyond. We do have a dream team of speakers, I believe. Tom Cochrane will be our first speaker, followed by Cheryl Cutt, Rhys Francis and Andy Pittman. And basically they will be looking progressively into the future, starting with Tom, who'll be talking about the work of the Australian e-Research Infrastructure Council, the work that has done over the last 12 months or so in response to the roadmap. Cheryl will be talking about the changes between 2008 and 2011 in the roadmap and the next steps. Rhys, uncharacteristically, will be talking about the future, and Andy will be looking even further into the picture with a very big picture from the researcher's perspective. As I said, this really is a dream team. So I'm very pleased to introduce first Professor Tom Cochrane, who, for those few of you who may not know him, he's the Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Technology, Information and Learning Support at QUT, a division of about some 500 people, combining the services of libraries, information, technology services, learning environments and technology services, e-learning services and a number of other areas. Tom is a renaissance man in the whole of the E and IT space and has done a wonderful job chairing QUT's Information Technology Governance Committee. He also chairs the Australian e-Research Infrastructure Council, and being a member of that myself, I can vouch for the appropriate hand that Tom takes in looking after us on that council. He has done many things in his career. I won't go through the list in full, but he was co-leader of the Creative Commons project, for which QUT is the institutional partner for Australia, and led the approach mandating open access for refereed research produced by the university into formal policy in 2003. Somewhat ahead of some of his peers, I have to say. So without further ado, I'll hand it over to Tom. Tom.
Thank you very much, Ron, for that fulsome introduction. My task today is fairly simple. I just want to take you through the process that the Council went through, along with many other people in Australia, in responding to the government's invitation to become involved with the 2011 Strategic Roadmap process. So that really was two things that we did. One was to respond to the discussion paper, which was released in April and attracted over 200 submissions, one of which was ours, and we got that response in early May. And then the government subsequently released an exposure draft, which I think attracted about 150 follow-up responses, and we were one of those follow-up responses in July. First, just a word more about the Council. I chair it. I'm also a member of the National Research Infrastructure Council, which was established in 2009. Rhys, whom I guess everyone knows, is the Executive Director of ERIC, and Claire, of course, is here in another form. We have also on the committee the main representatives of the infrastructure investments that have occurred so far. So we have Ron, who is from ANZ. We have Mel Bryce, who's associated with the Pawsey Centre, which is a computational investment in Western Australia. We have Graham Mitchell from Nectar, Brian Anker from RDSI, Chris Pegram from the NCI, and Paul Sherlock, who's there in couple of capacities. One is as president of the AAF, and the other is because of his involvement with the National Research Networks project. We also have some folk who are there by dint of general expertise. Suzanne Miller, who's the director of the South Australian Museum and is also a member of NRIC, the National Research Infrastructure Council. Andy Pittman, who's director of the ARC Centre for Excellence for Climate System Science and is based at the University of New South Wales. Joanne Daly from the CSIRO, and Gerard Goggin, who is from the HASS community and is Professor of Media and Communication at the University of Sydney. So that's the council as it's currently comprised. Most of us were engaged in the process that we took part in April and then subsequently. What we did, along with no doubt many in this room, is we sent a submission. That submission gave some overall thoughts and also responded to some specific questions that were raised in the discussion paper. Our comment on progress was that we thought that the current investment strategies, that is current by early 2011, which are to improve and support advanced computational modelling, to improve and support data management and create national data repositories, and to develop new research tools supporting analysis and collaboration, and to develop our research network. They're all worthwhile, they should all be supported, and they should all be strengthened in the future. So our general comment on progress was that. We reiterated the importance of data and the growing national attention to data. We reflected something that often comes up at Council, which is the issue of skills and expertise, and the best way to go about strengthening and building those out. We talked about the importance of funding, both in terms of flexibility and sustainability. There were 11 questions, for those who recall, that were posed in the discussion paper, and in responding to those 11 questions, we made a number of significant points. The first was to simply acknowledge the unabated rise in techniques in advanced modelling and their importance across many fields. The second was to refer to the coming challenge involved with pettascale to exascale computing and everything that that could mean. The third is the challenge of common understanding. The speed of change is so fast, it's hard to be confident about the various levels of understanding in academic communities, let alone in terms of the conversation which needs to occur between and among those academic communities and our most important stakeholders and influencers, particularly in government. We talked about the way that most disciplines are being involved in a revolution in the way data is affecting both the way research is done and the products of research. We talked about the emergence and probable acceleration in transdisciplinary developments that are part of e-research trends looking forward, and the importance of partnering with industry as well as referring again to the user skills challenge. So we made those points as we responded to the 11 questions that were in the discussion paper. We also gave a bit of a view about the assessment of progress. We said that on the theme of high-end visualisation, simulation and modelling, we thought that good experience is being developed, but that we need further building and development of that, and again referring to the evolution to exascale levels of operation. In terms of data management and reuse, our comment was that there was clear maturity in recognising the issues here. You can't help go from one session to another at this conference just in the last day and a half to see the level of activity that's been occurring that is around this theme. But at the same time, to be reminded how much needs to be done and just what the level of effort at a variety of levels there is. And we also talked about the theme of software tools and workflow, and also the issue of connectivity, and said that there we thought that perhaps there was a less coherent picture, but hopefully in another year or so we'll have a clearer idea of some of the main things that are developing. The discussion paper, as some will recall, invited respondents to list the barriers to successfully building an effective national e-research infrastructure. And we nominated 8 such barriers in our response. And some of these will be very familiar, I guess, to many people here. One is any lack of agreement on the means of supporting data as an enduring asset. Another is the motivation and behaviour of key infrastructure providers. I guess that's a comment on the alignment of everyone in terms of a national research purpose. A third was the scale of activity and the need to get a sustained level of investment. Of course, in a way, the roadmap process is really about trying to get a more sustained picture, but I'm sure that there were very few responses that didn't also comment on the issue of sustainability in funding. We also talked about the tension at the institutional level between collaborative imperatives and competition. In the world of research, competition is deeply in the DNA of most of our research institutions and their leading researchers. It's how we go about actually getting resource. And the potential difficulty that can arise, particularly at a kind of an executive level, in thinking about the difference between that day-to-day living, breathing, competitive stuff and the need to behave differently in terms of an approach to collaboration, particularly across institutions in consortia or in developing new arrangements. So we think that that's sometimes a barrier. We went on to talk about the way that service providers might be seen in a slightly less than optimal or well-trusted way if folk are also aware that they're developing their services on kind of bursts of funding with a continuing dependence on success in getting the next burst. That has to have an effect over a period and be a potential barrier. We talked about the willingness and rate at which institutions can make adjustments to move to shared infrastructure from perhaps smaller scale self-operated infrastructure that in one sense is of course less complex to manage. We talked about the change in balance affecting the way research funding bodies might accommodate what we do. And there are some debates in Australia in the past about the way research funding mechanisms that we have to date might enhance or inhibit the necessary funding of research infrastructure that goes to facilitate a lot of the research that's done. And we also talked about another barrier, which is that quite often, and perhaps understandably for some folk who are responding to these questions, there's an assumption that just about everything we're talking about is located in the higher education sector, and of course it is not. In Australia we have particularly significant investment and momentum in the CSIRO, but we also have other research being carried out in government and health sectors and elsewhere, which needs to be brought into view and to be prominent in considering the future of our e-research infrastructure. So that went in. An exposure draft was subsequently released. When we saw the exposure draft, we indicated in a much shorter submission that we had an overall support of the approach that we thought was being taken, but we restated our concerns in terms of the skills and expertise issue, and we also restated some points about data and its importance. So that's what occurred then. In the subsequent time, the 2011 Strategic Roadmap for Australian Research Infrastructure has indeed come together, been approved and is in the process of being promulgated. And to take that part of our discussion further, I now hand over to Cheryl. Thanks, Ron.
Thanks very much, Tom. And Tom's wisdom and balance was all over that very appropriate response to the development of the roadmap. I'd next like to call on Cheryl Cutt. Cheryl is the manager of the e-research section within the Research Infrastructure branch at the Department of Innovation, and she is one of those extremely able public servants who works incredibly hard, incredibly focused way on bringing an infrastructure that is appropriate to Australian researchers. I've worked with Cheryl on the Oran project, for example, and her commitment and passion there was absolutely evident. I don't think I could have done it without the support that Cheryl brought. She's been involved in the work of delivering NCRIS and Superscience since 2006, including as a principal author of the 2008 Strategic Roadmap. Prior to her work with the Department of Innovation, Cheryl worked on e-government policy with GMO, and one of her background pieces of trivia, which is not trivial, it comes in handy in all kinds of ways, is she's got a master's degree in anthropology from ANU. Cheryl.
Thank you, Ron. And I hope that my biography was going to be brief because I only gave you a couple of paragraphs, which means that I may be able to beg your indulgence if I go over time today. Okay. So I realised as I was sitting up there that I'm the only member on stage who is not a member of the Australian E-Research Infrastructure Council. So I too will pretend to be Claire today, given that she is a member on that council. And I guess if my iPad would work and get me back to the first page, it would be very helpful. So it's really good to see so many of you here today for what I believe is the fourth e-research forum convened jointly by the Department of Innovation, Industry, Science and Research, as well as the Australian E-Research Infrastructure Council. And please bear with me for a moment as I get my iPad to work again. It appears not to be sensitive to my touch. So as Ron mentioned, I am the manager of the e-research area within the research infrastructure branch of the department, and that is the branch that's responsible for administering the national investments in research infrastructure in this country under the National Collaborative Research Infrastructure Strategy and the Superscience Initiative. And my part in the panel today is to talk to you about the 2011 Roadmap for Australian Research Infrastructure, which is up on screen, and hopefully my presentation is going to come up soon to someone at the back. Sorry, I was meant to do that, I believe. Note to the other speakers. Okay, so I will briefly remind you that this is the third such roadmap that the government has developed in relation to the direction for research infrastructure in Australia. And for those of you who are fortunate enough to attend the opening plenary yesterday, you would have heard Mr. John Ryan, who's the chair of the National Research Infrastructure Council, speak to you broadly about the 2011 roadmap. I don't propose to repeat his words here today, other than to briefly reiterate from the Australian government's point of view that the roadmap is a key document that will influence future investments and development in relation to research infrastructure. And this, of course, includes e-research infrastructure. So the 2011 roadmap provides a strategic vision outlining a high-level map for the national research infrastructure landscape 5 to 10 years into the future. And it provides a strategic vision which we believe is validated by the deep engagement of research sector stakeholders and others in its development. So as Tom mentioned this morning, we received over 360 written submissions in response to our consultation process over the development of the roadmap. And the 2011 roadmap reinforces the importance of e-research infrastructure in supporting research and positions it as an enabling capability relevant across all disciplines and areas of research. So at the recent meeting of the Council of Australian University Directors of IT, I was asked how difficult it was to actually frame a new direction for e-research infrastructure, given that the last direction was only articulated in 2008. And my response, which was in fact a gut response, was that it was challenging, given that many of the things that we said in the 2008 roadmap are still valid today. And much of the investment that we have made in e-research infrastructure since and as a consequence of the 2008 roadmap under the Super Science Initiative is still being implemented. As a result, some of the impact of our larger investments, which include investments in network enhancements, in data storage, and in collaboration tools and resources, is yet to be felt by the research sector. The fact that much of the 2008 roadmap in terms of e-research remained valid was certainly a point of discussion by the expert working group on e-research infrastructure that the department convened to assist it in developing the e-research aspects of the roadmap. That particular group was chaired by Professor Attila Brungs from the University of Technology, Sydney. However, it was important for us to take stock of key developments internationally and in Australia that will influence the way forward, including those technological developments and advancements towards exascale computing and cloud computing. And in developing the 2011 roadmap, it was essential for us to understand the level of support or otherwise for the initiatives and the types of infrastructure that we have funded so far under NCRIS and Super Science. In terms of key drivers for change, we have advanced from the 2008 roadmap in that we now have a far better understanding of the reality and the nature and the implications of what we call a tsunami of data, and which was referred to yesterday as a deluge of data, so I'm not entirely sure what the difference is between those two. And there is more emphasis in the 2011 roadmap on the need to deal with and manage the growing volume and increasing complexity of data, not only the data generated by researchers, but that data which is relevant to researchers. And that comes back to the remarks that Brian Haydorn made yesterday about dark data, the data that is quite hard to find. And for us, this includes data generated by others that is important for research. For example, data generated by government agencies, as Ron mentioned, I think. And these government agencies might be bodies such as the Australian Bureau of Statistics or Geosciences Australia, but also by industry and by private companies such as managers of utilities, something that is quite important in the built environment space, a project on which I worked with Ron. This focus on the challenges and opportunities presented by data is pervasive not only in the e-research chapter, but throughout the roadmap. And as I scroll through the slides, you will see a few of the remarks made about data throughout the roadmap. I do think that the new 2011 roadmap makes some key points and reassertions which are important for the way forward for e-research infrastructure. I'm sorry, I'm going through these quotes really fast because I have to get to the next slide. I believe that we have made some progress since 2008 from trying to convince our audience of the importance of e-research infrastructure, something was still an emphasis in the 2008 roadmap, to more of a focus on how it is important and linking it closer to what our audience is now aware of. The 2011 roadmap identified that we need to enable a greater, deeper integration of e-research across Australia's research community and raise awareness of e-research across many disciplines. We need to more clearly articulate the precise benefits of e-research to the researcher, but also to other key stakeholders. And the benefits of e-research can only be fully realized when the user has a proper understanding of the relevance and potential of the infrastructure to his or her work, and can, as a result, seek to leverage the infrastructure appropriately. And by this, we mean a proper understanding, but not necessarily a technical understanding. So, for instance, we don't necessarily need or even want the researcher to know what NECTAR, the National E-Research Collaborative Tools and Resources Project, stands for, nor how the research data storage Infrastructure Initiative is working with the Australian National Data Service to deliver data infrastructure. We may just need the researcher to understand that a particular initiative suits their purposes in a particular way. So the 2011 roadmap reiterates some messages about how e-research infrastructure supports new and different ways of doing and advancing research. And it places emphasis, yet again, on the key areas of data management, data access, data storage, high-performance computing, collaboration tools and resources, and high-performance broadband networks. And in so doing, acknowledges the growing role of software and mobile computing in the national space. So the 2011 roadmap also recognizes that implementation has begun or that advances have been made in key areas. The 2008 roadmap touted certain areas of emphasis for infrastructure development. And while our investments have continued previous NCRIS work in high-performance computing, in collaboration tools and resources, in data sharing and management, new areas of investment under SuperScience, most notably in data storage, are now being implemented. And we are seriously enhancing the Australian Research and Education Network under the SuperScience National Research Networks project. So at least in terms of investment, we have advanced key areas identified in the 2008 roadmap. The idea behind the 2011 roadmap is to consolidate and build on those key investments. Finally, while as in the 2008 roadmap we discuss each area of requirement for infrastructure into the future, we now place greater emphasis on the need for deliverers and investors to better understand and enable the linkages between those initiatives we invest in or have invested in. We need greater integration and coordination of our e-research infrastructure investments, not only those that the Australian government funds, but also those that are being developed across the states and the territories and within institutions. And while the 2008 roadmap pointed to overarching governance, leadership, and skills development to enhance that coordination, the 2011 roadmap is more insistent and arguably more precise about the need for this integration and coordination. For example, it includes possible principles for coordination and integration. To me, that insistence on coordinating and integrating our investments is paramount in the 2011 e-research chapter and points to the need for the user to have a seamless experience. And I think it will indeed color our way forward in terms of any further developments we make in this space. For me, and I was deeply engaged in the development of the entire 2008 roadmap, as Ron mentioned, the key differences between 2008 and now are in some ways represented by the significantly greater readiness of stakeholders to engage in discussion around data and e-research infrastructure more generally. In the 2011 process of developing the roadmap, we had far more precision in how people engaged in discussion around e-research. Certainly, we had far more feedback than we had in the 2008 process. And I certainly think that there is a greater understanding of the importance of e-research infrastructure, if not all the shades of relevance to capabilities and areas of research. Finally, I will spend a few moments more talking about the next steps arising from the release of the roadmap. So this is the third such roadmap developed by the government, as I mentioned earlier. We embarked on the process of developing a new vision for research infrastructure in order to guide our next steps in the space. It was not enough to know that more investment is needed. We needed to know where and how that investment was needed. So we had responded to many of the needs that our stakeholders raised for our attention in the 2008 roadmap in relation to e-research infrastructure. And e-research infrastructure gained a significant boost of investment under the Australian Government SuperScience Initiative, an investment of $312 million, which is more than a third of the total SuperScience Initiative's funds. However, currently, we are in a tight budgetary situation. And even with the 2011 roadmap behind us, it will be challenging to secure new investment from government. But we continue to place key importance on research infrastructure, on its benefits for research and innovation broadly, as well as on the flow-on effects for industry and the economy. And we will be relying on our stakeholders and the capabilities we have funded to support us in the way forward, including in continuing to articulate the key benefits of the investments that we have so far made. And as we move forward, we will also need to know how investment might be prioritized specifically within the 19 capabilities in the roadmap, and for this audience, particularly for the e-research infrastructure capability, should investment be forthcoming. And we will need to know that communities and collaborations stand ready to help map the way forward for specific investments, should funding be provided. And finally, I will note that we have substantial investments yet to be completely implemented in data storage, in collaboration tools and resources, in cloud computing and virtual labs, in high-performance computing, in network connectivity, and so on. In order to prepare ourselves for the future, these investments need to be implemented in a way that provides a sound foundation to build on. And that means, I believe, that they need to be strategic, they need to be well-placed, and they need to foster collaborative relationships and alliances that can be relied on in the long term, and that can be called on at short notice should further funding become available. Thank you, and I look forward to working with many of you in the future in relation to further developments in the space.
Thank you, Cheryl. And I think that we should all really understand and be grateful for the enormous amount of work that went into the development of that roadmap, both from the community itself, but also in meeting incredibly tight deadlines from the department. They sounded, when I first heard them, to be absurd, but the department, as it is wont, rose to the challenge. So well done, and thanks for that talk, Cheryl. Our next speaker is Rhys Francis, who's well known to all of you. Rhys started life as a mathematician and then migrated to computer science with his PhD. He's worked in a range of areas: a software engineer, a software systems consultant, an academic and researcher in parallel and distributed systems. He spent a good part of his career at CSIRO and has had a number of executive roles there, including CSIRO ICT sector leader, as well as director for CSIRO's high performance computing area. I think it's fair to say that in a very strong career, Rhys really hit his sweet spot when it came to the whole area of e-research and the contribution that he's made to the nature of the investments and the scale of the investments made in e-research infrastructure is something that I'm only too well aware of. I think it's been a wonderful achievement, which is probably the reason that when Microsoft recently published something on either the data deluge or tsunami or e-research, I can't remember which, they had a number of quotes on the front cover. The first was Bill Gates, which it had to be, and the second was Rhys Francis, which is pretty impressive. He was the executive director of, well, he basically worked as the NCRIS facilitator for the platform's collaboration capability, which is, I suppose, where all this stemmed from. He's the executive director of the Australian E-Research Infrastructure Council, and he, in that role, leads the development of e-research services that can assist Australian research adopt advanced modelling, analysis and collaboration techniques. There's one other thing you should know about Rhys Francis, and that's once I was in a debate in CSIRO, and Rhys was the chairman of that debate, and he used a shepherd's crook to pull me off when I went over time, literally and painfully. I have that shepherd's crook under the table here, so thank you, Rhys.
Right, thank you, Ron, and it's a pleasure to see you all here. It's an entirely exciting number of people, I think, and it's really wonderful to hear the level of conversation and discussion and just the sheer energy of the conference. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the e-research infrastructure that we're putting in place and where we'll be in 2014 and what are some of the big picture questions that you might like to ask a question about. So, for Australian research, and it's important to understand that, for Australian research, advancing discovery in a technology and information-rich world, and that is the real issue. The technology and the information environment in which research is going is just exploding in front of us. So we actually have a definition of e-research infrastructure, so, and you know, please use this definition. It's very simple. It is ICT, it's assets, facilities, services. They support research within institutions and across the system. And it's about excellent research and innovation outcomes. And you might say, well, that's not exactly precise. So we get a little bit more precise, and this is ARIC's definition. It's a cornerstone of modern research, increasingly a cornerstone. It's about advancing the frontiers of research and in ways that otherwise would be impossible. It is really true. The technology permits research to be done that is otherwise impossible to do. And it does that in three ways we sort of focus on. You'll see from our feedback to the roadmap there were three basic themes. It's about manipulation, manage, share, integrate, reuse research data at ever-increasing scales. It's about new insights through ever more powerful simulations, modelling and data analysis. And it's about more extensive research teams and sharing resources and working together more effectively and productively. They're the kind of three dimensions that drive forward the impact of our infrastructure. A little while ago, I was challenged to produce the one slide that explains it all. Spent a fair amount of time on it, and I eventually produced the one slide that explains it all. It's precise, it's to the point, it's not confusing, it's non-threatening, it's simple. You look away, you look back, it's still there, it's reliable. I could sell $10,000 communication project for that. There's so many nice messages, right? There's a bit more to it, but just think, e-research infrastructure. Well, if you read the roadmap, it's about networks, it's about data, it's about compute, and it's about tools. And they're IT things. And they come to you as IT, and they come to you in your environment where you are on your system, helping you do what you want to do. That is the key message. It's IT, it's networks, it's data, it's compute, and it's tools, and it comes to you and it helps you. And we need to get that message clear in our heads and clear in everyone's heads. And of course then the question is, well, what's going on behind that? That's nice. We've got some very big investments. And they are in computing, so we can do computational modelling, data analysis and visualise results at scales that are just inconceivable before now. We can keep data and observations, describe, collect, share, find and reuse them, again, at a volume, scale and complexity that till now just was not possible. And we can use new tools and applications and work remotely and collaborate in the cloud. And you can see NCI, PAWSI, Nectar, ANZ and RDSI, and the network and the Access Federation providing the access. That is the national investment in research infrastructure. And what it turns into is real buildings with really big systems in them and lots of heat and people like Ben running around making them work for us. Other buildings with big data stores in them. Instruments connected to collect data and describe it automatically, live, instantaneously. Whole buildings of research facilities that collect data and make it available. Processes to do that. And above that, the actual research that actually researches things we couldn't do without this technology. Lets us work around the world in ways that we couldn't do before and lets us access data, draw a square over a bit of Australia and find out everything there is about that part of the country. We will get to that particular point. And why do we do that? Well, we want to understand mechanisms that are impossible to observe or experiment with directly. That's what we want to do. We want to undertake research studies at a scale that we've never been able to do before and generate new theories using data that was previously inconceivable. That is the environment of e-research, and we are providing the infrastructure. But we must remember there is this environment as well as the infrastructure. So that's our story, that's our one slide. Where will we be in 2014? Well, we will have better networks, we will have better data, we will have better computing, and we'll have better tools. Exactly what the roadmap says. We will have optical fibre all the way across the country, not just halfway across the country. We'll have probably have optical fibre all the way up to Darwin. It's kind of amazing. We will have single sign-on, I insist. We will have single sign-on. We simply cannot ask someone for a password every time they touch data on RDSI. or every time they use a tool on Nectar. We cannot demand a user to provide a password. We must make single sign-on work. We will have high reliance service and high reliability servers. We will have entirely new data centres built just to hold the computing we need. We will have the computing in those buildings at scales we've never had before. We will have those computers producing information products that cannot be derived other than using supercomputing, and researchers will use those information products. We will actually have a 5-fold growth in the computer power above the technology curve by 2014. It's a very, very big step forward. We will have more and more data systems automated. We will have hundreds of petabytes of data in repositories. Data publication will be possible, Russ. And for the very first time ever, we will have a corpus of Australian data. Actually, not dark data, light data. That is the very first time we will actually have that body of data. And then Glenn will come along and produce dozens of virtualised research tools and applications. We will have a petascale national research cloud, which will kind of be a world-class system. And we will have labs using digital workflows. That is what you are going to do in the next 3 years. It is ultra, ultra exciting. Our story is e-research infrastructure is networks, compute, data and tools. It's IT, and it's delivered to you to work for you where you want it, the way you want it. It would be really good if we made that true. That is what we have to achieve. Now, on the council, we have a sort of functional approach. So we look at that and we say, well, we need to extend our bandwidth, we need to improve our access methods, we need better HPC, we need larger data collections, we need better data management, and we need improved research tools. And we kind of think of it as providing capability, and we have projects that do that, and they build buildings and put big boxes in them, and we want to integrate with research, and we have projects like ANZ and Nectar, which are much more engaged with the research community and respond in a project-by-project basis with those research communities to connect the two. If you go around the world, all of the major investments are a push and a pull, and we've got 2 feet, and we have to walk up the hill, 1 foot, both, right? We have to do both. And guess what? It is complicated, but the reason is we actually have a project specifically targeting each of those requirements. It doesn't help us to say, well, we did computing much better, but we sort of forgot to get around to storage. Or we did storage, but we didn't do tools. Or we did tools and we didn't do something else. We actually have projects specifically targeting the improvement of those particular capabilities. And that's great for a development. But sometime in the next 3 years, we need to go to a more vertically integrated delivery. And I can imagine RDSI and Nectar and the supercomputing investments producing a vertical set of investments across that horizontal picture. And that's the kind of transition we can imagine happening. What are our major challenges? Well, we take all of that, and in fact, there are similar challenges everywhere. And the good news is we can describe our challenges at the very highest level by looking at what comes out of research. Skills and expertise is an output of the research activity. Methods and techniques is an output of the research activity. Findings and results are an output. And we contribute to all of those in particular ways. Well, we operate world-class infrastructure, and, you know, I look around this room and I see world-class expertise. If you want to know where it is, it's actually in this room. We have world-class expertise. We are actually really getting good at adding skills and tools to research, because that's what we have to do. Researchers should not do what we do. We should help them do what they do. And we need to deliver that. And I think we're seeing an evolution in the way that happens in universities with e-research directors and e-research groups and state-based groups. And we're actually getting better. You're getting better. We're getting better at the skills it takes to actually do that. Software. Well, the huge thing about software is we have to encode these new research methods. Our software is what we propagate into the future. We send our skills into the future, we send our software into the future, we send our data into the future. We don't send the disk drives and the computers and the networks. They kind of deteriorate. So when you think about software, think about contributing it. And what worries me is I look across the projects and I see software projects trying to own the user. So I suggest we be the shoulders they stand on. That's the right way to think about software. Now, is a portal a shoulder you stand on, Or is it a window that says you can only look out in this direction at that height? What are the shoulders? The software that is the future that researchers stand on. We need to understand that much, much better. As Tom said, this is the bit we don't fully understand. Data. Well, I've been thinking about what is it that makes the difference in data. And we're getting now to a scale of data where it's actually possible to research the real world. Not a theory, not an experiment, but in fact enough observation to actually deal directly with the complexity of the real world. And I think that's the huge shift, and that's what's exciting. I'm sure Andy will tell us this is a big problem. It's not what's the theory of climate say, it's what is the actual climate going to do. We need to research the real world. So I think the volume of data and the complexity we can now handle connects reality to experiment and theory in new ways, and that is what is ultra exciting about the volume of data we're gathering. Getting close to the end here, Ron, you haven't got your crook out? Guiding design principles. So I thought I'd give you some ideas to start thinking about questions. We're going to have 500 petabytes of data in the sector in 5 years' time. It's kind of frightening, really. If you wanted to move 100 petabytes from Melbourne to Sydney, a truck is a good idea. A truck is a good idea. You could probably move it in 2 weeks. You figure out what it costs to do it electronically in 2 weeks and whether you really want to pay that much. Moving data is a big problem. So it's a lot of data. What does it mean? It means that not all data can be everywhere. Wow, this is like saying not every library can have every book. It's kind of obvious, isn't it? If there's only a few books, every library could have a copy. If there's trillions of books, that's not true. So we have to cooperate and share our data infrastructure. On the other hand, as has been pointed out, research must be competitive. It matters how fast you go, it matters that you're not inhibited, it matters that you can get there first. Research is inherently competitive. So we have to think about the cooperation and the competition in data, and we need to work on that. I say we can only afford the data management we can automate. Now, I can weaken that to we need the tools that help us to manage data, but if a person can manage a petabyte now, they better manage an exabyte in 10 years' time. We just can't pour people into data management, and we just can't resource curation to the max. We actually have to make hard calls, and we have to understand it. We only move data once or maybe twice, maybe a few times, but really we don't want to move data. We actually want to move our tools and our information products to the data, and we have to work on systems that do that. And I'm thinking that data is a system goal, not a research goal. How many researchers really want to manage data? Now, I've been talking to some of the international participants, and their answer is no one does. Researchers don't manage data. They use it, they do things, and then they want to just get on with it. So is it a system goal or is it a research goal? And when I think that, I think, well, there's something between the system and the researchers, and it's called an institution. I think we have to understand how institutions participate in the data infrastructure of our future, and maybe you've got others. But what we need to do is have these guiding principles rather than the architecture or the solution, because in fact it's a very complicated picture. A lot of people are participating. There is no one size fits all. So what are our principles? What next? Well, data is the problem of the moment, and the solution is the principles and the actions. And the really good thing that we're doing is we are actually doing stuff. We could have a plan, but we have a plan of action, and that's really important. When you talk to people who've worked in data for a lifetime, the first thing they'll say is get on with it. And when it's getting worse fast, you don't want to wait, get on with it. Make progress, learn and adapt is the way to deal with data. But we need to understand our principles. We could talk about software when you want to ask questions, and I might say in the long run a researcher can only afford the software somebody else maintains. We have to think about research software. How many researchers build microscopes? Well, why not? Well, why? We have some researchers who build microscopes. Most people just use theirs. We have to have software look like that. If I built a microscope that was hidden away in secret and I saw things no one else saw and I wrote to Nature and said, would you publish this? They'll say, explain your microscope. If we have hand-built software hidden away which only one person understands and it produces a result, of what value is it? and we have to understand how to leverage and use common shared software. So I think the right answer is maintenance of software is a problem, and researchers don't maintain software, their own software. So I think there's some of the questions, but we have 6 investments over the next 2 years. They will change forever the Australian research landscape. Let's maximise the impact of that. The e-research train is leaving the station, and we're on it, and it's going to be great. So e-research infrastructure, networks, data, compute and tools. It's information technology and communication stuff. It's delivered to you. It works for you. It does what you need. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Rhys. And I think the picture is becoming clearer and clearer as time goes on, as Rhys's talk has illustrated. The last speaker in this session, before we take questions, is Professor Andy Pitman. Andy's a Professor in Climate Science at the University of New South Wales, and he's the Director of the ARC Centre of Excellence for Climate Systems Science. He has a broad background in climate science with interests in climate change, climate impacts and land cover change. Particularly, he's worked on how land cover change and increasing greenhouse gases change the probability of extreme events. He's been a lead author on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and on the Copenhagen Diagnosis. He's a member of the Advisory Board of Risk Frontiers, an industry-funded centre that explores questions of climate, volcanic and hydrological risk for the insurance industry. He was the New South Wales Climate Scientist of the Year in 2010 and was appointed to the Australian Federal Government Science Advisory Panel to the Climate Commission in 2011. As a user of e-research, as a scientist working with these things, Andy always makes a passionate commitment to and contribution to ARIC meetings, where I'm delighted to be his colleague. Andy.
So, how do I get to this? Rule 1 is, if you use a Mac, don't swap to a PC. How do I do this? Yes. So other rule 1 is never follow Rhys. Because it's going to be very hard to engage your attention after that, but I'll give it a go. So I'm going to give you a quick user perspective. I'm a climate scientist. That usually means I get booed by the audience. For most of the audience I speak to, and I'm very grateful I haven't been booed yet this morning. I'm the Director of the ARC Centre of Excellence for Climate Systems Science, which is a consortium of a range of universities and other organisations. This is what climate scientists do. Unfortunately, I can't tell you the carbon tax went through this morning, because I don't think it has yet, but we're in that space. So we're interested in things like why the Earth is warming, why Greenland ice sheets are collapsing, why we see increased frequency of extremes in the global meteorological systems, why the ocean and the land is warming, and the tree, which is my particular interest, why trees take up carbon and why under warming they seem to collapse and release that carbon back into the atmosphere. Unfortunately for those new undergraduates that turn up at university sometimes saying, I've had a rain gauge in my garden for the last 5 years, I really want to be a climate scientist, we don't do that stuff. We try to describe these systems mathematically using differential equations on the sorts of big computer systems that Ben looks after for us and others, of course. And we are very heavily in both the data and the high-performance computing space. And I'm going to really focus on some of that and where my concerns lie in my 10 minutes this morning. So I've got 3 problems. I've got a problem that my computer codes are expensive. I've got a problem that the data sets we create are big, and most important, and I'll focus towards the end, there is a problem with human resources. So I'm going to start with some background on the costs of our computer codes to explain why I am forever pleading with NCI to give me more computer time. So this is how we do the global climate. We break the Earth into four-dimensional system. If you've ever watched the version of Star Trek where Spock was playing four-dimensional chess, if you think about four-dimensional chess, that's what we do. In each of those little squares, which are now down to a spatial resolution of about 100 by 100 kilometers, or a degree by a degree, we solve every equation that you could think could possibly relate to the climate system. So we have about 65,000 cells over the Earth, including up through the atmosphere and down through the ocean. So we have about 50 vertical layers, which gives us something like 3 million grid points. There's a large number of unknowns, but we might conservatively think of it as 7, which gives us something like 22 million variables, 30 calculations per variable, 700 million calculations per time step, 15-minute time step, 70 billion calculations per day. We run our models at least for a century, which gives you lots and lots of problems on big supercomputers. So our codes are expensive. When you hit return on the computer, it's usually 6 to 9 months before you get all the results that you need. So we're not in the playing around on our desktop space. Problems have become rather more complex in the last few years because we now run what are called realizations or ensembles. So we've moved from saying what our model says will be the warming globally as a result of doubling CO2 to looking at that probabilistically. So we look at the probability of warming by certain amounts into the future, which means we now need to run our models hundreds to thousands of times, each model, each simulation, to get probabilistic projections of how things will change. So we've gone from running a simulation to running hundreds of simulations to get that cutting-edge science that lets us get our publications into Science and Nature rather than a journal you've never heard of. So our computational challenge is enormous. We also are moving to finer and finer spatial resolution, and it's not a luxury. This is a tornado formed from one of the bushfires in Victoria. Some simulations run at NCI by Michael Reeder, who's at Monash University. The spatial scale of this, you probably can't see, is 30 by 15 kilometers. So if you're running with a spatial resolution of 100 kilometers, you can't resolve these processes. One resolves these processes by starting to run one's models at 1 kilometer resolution, or 500 meters, or 200 meter resolution. And for each doubling of resolution, it's an order of magnitude increase in computational effort. And you can't capture these phenomena and the consequences of these phenomena unless you can run your models at this sort of resolution. This is a slice down through the ocean. This is some simulations also done at NCI by Andy Hogg at ANU, showing the kinds of structure of the vortices and the eddies in the deep ocean. These actually turn out to transfer an awful lot of heat, salt, and momentum within the ocean system. And if you don't resolve the ocean at these very fine spatial resolutions, you can't capture these processes. And there's some other stuff from Andy Hogg at ANU, looking at the difference on the top of running your models at fairly coarse resolution, or at the bottom, which is the holy grail in climate science, eddy resolving ocean models, which are running the global ocean at maybe 1/4 to 1/8 to 1/16 of a degree kind of spatial resolution. And these actually hurt petascale computer systems. They are actually tremendously computationally expensive. But you begin to get the subtleties of the structure of the ocean when you can resolve the ocean at these sorts of spatial resolutions. So we have a problem with the costs of our code, but you've heard the solution this morning. We are moving towards the exascale computer. And I actually thought about asking all the people who build big computers in the room to put their hands up to say who wouldn't have an exascale computer they could sell the Australian government in a few years' time, let's say 2020, but I won't embarrass you because I'm sure you'd all absolutely commit to an exascale computer by 2020, and the climate community will be very welcoming of that. Our second problem is data. In 2001, the third assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, that's the organization that reports through the United Nations to explain to governments that we have a problem with global warming, reported. And the data sets that they reported from, the data sets that were part of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, were 50 gigabytes. In the fourth assessment report that came out about 6 years later, it was about 35 terabytes. The current report, which is due to be released in 2013, is estimated at about 30 petabytes of data. Unfortunately, we don't stop there. The next one due in 2020, I have no idea how much data, but it will be in the exascale. So in order for your community to be competitive in world climate science, through to the sixth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we are going to have to be able to slice and dice exascale data sets. And I don't know how to do that. But we have a solution, because the e-research strategy, which Cheryl talked about earlier, talks about the transition towards the exascale data systems. The third problem we have are the lack of human resources. So I need, in climate science, IT professionals with enough science to understand the problems I face, or scientists with enough IT to be able to develop my code in Fortran 95 or similar via SVN to agreed coding standards. I need them to be able to write simple and elegant scripts. I need them to be able to write tools to analyze petascale and bigger NetCDF archives, and I need them to write and implement model test plans, which all seems pretty straightforward. Of course, I need that in the understanding that I can't offer career development or long-term appointments, because most of them will be employed by ARC discovery grants or linkage grants, that most scientists won't value their contribution because they're just doing IT, that universities will often consider them second-class citizens, and the salaries will be low compared to the industry, which says we have a problem. The ARC Centre of Excellence has taken a very small number of steps to try to resolve that. The ARC Centre of Excellence gets 7 years funding, which makes the world of difference. So we have appointed our computational modelling systems leader at professorial salary, which caused some trouble at the university that he was appointed at, because he was only IT, so why would we want to appoint him at a professorial salary? We've appointed 4 further people, but they all came with professional IT backgrounds. They weren't employed because they understood the science. They were employed because they had a good understanding of IT. And that caused me trouble in that process within the Centre of Excellence, because other colleagues wanted more scientists, because scientists do science. They didn't really necessarily value the IT contribution, which says they're not thinking ahead. We also insisted within the Centre of Excellence on a limited number of software packages. I don't know if many of you work intimately with scientists, but we always want the next package and the next variation of the package, and you shouldn't be too hard to install it and get it running for me. Can you just do it, and then I'll do my science, without the understanding that that takes a long-term investment to scaffold that software over time to keep it up to standard. We have implemented something that scientists struggle with the concept of, and that's coding standards. I heard Reese say we need to get the scientists out of the code development, and I couldn't agree more. I wish to ban scientists from writing the codes that we use, because they are beyond the capacity of the scientists to maintain, any more than I would want an IT engineer doing climate science. Different skills, let's build those skills together. We've also insisted on open source software and data sets, which has caused some trouble. We've insisted that the computational modelling support team is part of the Centre Executive, not some hanging-on group who don't get valued within the organisation. And most important, the Centre has partnered with ANDS and NCI, because I don't think the climate community has a future unless we can integrate the skills and techniques and contributions of those sorts of groups into the next generation of climate science. And we really can't just move our codes around to different computer systems now. NCI are absolutely fundamental to our capacity to maintain internationally competitive. Whilst I've got 3 problems, I've also got 3 opportunities. E-research strategy to transition towards the exascale computer and the exascale data system, I think this is fine. I see the roadmap, I see the documentation coming out of government, I talk to some of the people who build these systems. I don't think there's any problem with the Australian research community having access to an exascale computer, an exascale data system by around 2020. The problem is I don't think we've thought about how we're going to use it. And I think that's an immense challenge for us. I don't think we've thought about how to use an exascale computer or the data systems that need to be integrated with it. We need to be able to utilize the exascale in our research. It's not just climate science, of course. I don't think anybody would build an exascale computer system for the climate community. It's many other important communities ranging from bioinformatics, chemistry, astronomy, physics, many, many others. So there's this document which has been waved around a few times. I hope you've all read it. This talks about the building of the hardware systems, primarily the data systems, the computational systems, and it does mention the need to have people who can manage and look after those systems. This is another one that many of you won't have necessarily seen, came out this year, Research Skills for an Innovative Future. It talks about the skill sets needed in the workplace that's doing the sorts of problem solving that I've talked about. And it's also worth a read. So my guess, exascale comes in 2020. And of course, most of you will be aware that it's 2012 next month. Some of us think it should be Easter about now, but it seems to be November. If any of you have got kids who are starting degrees in March next year, they will complete their PhDs at about the time the exascale computer comes online. I reckon it takes about 3 years to rebuild an undergraduate program at a university, and our undergraduate programs in science don't take IT seriously. So we have a sort of timescale problem here. We know what's coming in terms of the hardware and some of the software systems, but we're not recognizing the need to retrain our science students from their undergraduate through their graduate programs to be able to utilize the tools that we now can see coming along in the future. So I think our problem isn't the hardware. I think our problem is, where are we going to find the people in climate science to work on our problems for us and be able to hold them against the physicists, the bioinformatics, the chemists, and all those other nasty research communities that would wish to poach those particular graduate students that the climate community wants to hold on to. So I think our problem are people. I think we haven't taken account of the length of time it takes to rebuild an undergraduate program and a graduate program to ensure that the students who start now and will finish when the exascale computer gets switched on have the skills to actually be able to use the exascale computer. Thank you.
So, we now have an opportunity to ask questions of the panel. I'm sure you'll agree with me. We've just heard 4 really interesting and stimulating talks going from the reality of the current roadmap process through to the futures and challenges in the environment, for example, with funding possibilities that Cheryl alluded to. What it all actually looks like, a very clear picture from Reece about what it looks like and where we need to go. And I think what it translates to for an individual research community. And it's interesting that ultimately all of this comes back to people. So we've got an opportunity now to ask questions to the speakers this morning. I would ask you, when you want to ask a question, if you wouldn't mind stating your name and affiliation and maybe the person to whom you would like to address the question. So over to you.
Martin Sevier from the School of Physics at the University of Melbourne. I'm one of the nasty people that's competing against Andy. I'm also CI in the ARC Centre of Excellence for research in particle physics at the terascale. And one thing I'm particularly interested in is international collaboration and international connectivity, and this, tension between competing and collaborating. So I guess I'd like to hear, I didn't hear a lot of conversation about that. So I invite the panel to speak to those points.
Yes, it's working. So are you asking whether we relate to international developments or whether we are connecting overseas?
Well, basically, I see a lot of opportunity for reducing costs by reusing international standards. And
Absolutely, yes.
And I think that we've missed the boat a bit in the previous round. So I'm very interested in making sure that we don't do it on the next round.
Yes, so look, I think we do understand that, and if we get rid of the phones, if we look at how we identify projects, one of the key criteria is are we rebuilding something that's already been done? And if we look at what Glenn will be doing in Nectar and what was done in previous research tools, us joining international teams is a key way to sustain software. So we actually are strong on that. I think if you look at the data processes, it's all standards-based. It's really our challenge is standard development takes an enormously long time. I think we, in our current investments, don't have the money to resource people into standards development, and I think that's a problem. So while in our projects we'll say, well, if you're not applying a standard, maybe this project is not an appropriate project. But can we fund the development of standards? I think that's much harder. On the infrastructure front, all of the investments are deeply engaged with the equivalent investments internationally. Right? So, and I think if you read the roadmap, there's a question about exascale, which is the fast track might be to join an exascale system and then decide when to build one. And I think the issue there is just how many would be the right number to start before you actually know how to use them.
Well, our own experience is that joining certainly helped.
Absolutely. So I think, if you go and talk to Ben and others and Pawsey and so on, they're constantly overseas integrated with these developments, but at the government level, there is the question about having funding that would permit that. And current funding, EIF funding, would not permit that. Right, so it's a restriction on the funding. But if you read the roadmap, the option of buying into an exascale is on the strategy as something we really need to seriously think about, like we did for the synchrotron. Yeah? Is that kind of helping you?
Yeah.
But just before you do, I think Cheryl wants to add something to that.
Yeah, thanks, Martin, for that question. It is quite relevant from the Australian government's perspective to look at international developments and how we can complement and not duplicate the international investments that are occurring with the investments that we make in the Australian space. So as an example, and referred to it just then, the Pawsey Centre in Western Australia, which is a high-performance computing centre with an initial focus on radio astronomy, but also, of course, looking at other areas of research, is a key part of our attempts to get the Square Kilometre Array, which is a major radio astronomy international initiative, probably the biggest scientific initiative ever actually embarked on. We are using the Pawsey Centre as one of the key elements in the bid for the Square Kilometre Array to be sited in Western Australia. And some of the investments we're making in networking, in broadband networks in Western Australia are also a key part of complementing what we can do in terms of our international engagement around radio astronomy, as well as our international engagement through connectivity to the rest of the world. So I guess, there are many initiatives in which, we engage with our international friends in the research infrastructure space, not just in e-research. Some examples are, our work on the EMBL and on the Giant Magellan Telescope, but also things like, our capability in the integrated marine observing space, So IMOS, the Integrated Marine Observing System, is a key part of what we call the Global Ocean Observing System, or GOOS. And, we each play our part in that particular system. So it is about complementing and not duplicating. And, we also have to take account of the fact that we've got limited resources, so we need to be quite strategic about where we place those resources.
I'm Peter Murray-Rust from the University of Cambridge, UK. And first of all, can I say that I am very impressed by what is happening in Australia, and I have been for several years. I've been through 10 years or 7 years of the UK eScience programme, and I want to point out some of the dangers that I hope you would avoid. So the first was when Rhys mentioned institutions. I hope that this does not map onto individual universities and maps onto things at a much more either domain level or a national level. So I believe, for example, that national laboratories are far more relevant for the management of data systems and so on than individual universities, which, first of all, are usually too small to do this. And secondly, are actually geared up to compete rather than collaborate in many cases. I think, for example, that institutional repositories have completely failed in the UK and probably elsewhere as a support for data, and they never will do. Secondly, I want to pick up on Andy's, and I am very glad to see this is recorded because I think this has been a fantastic session. The question of how we support open research as a business model is key to us. So Andy highlighted the fact I'm a computational chemist. I'm a real scientist. I write code, I run code, and so on to answer scientific problems. How do we support that code? Because the problem in chemistry, which is one of the worst subjects, is that it is actually run by closed commercial organizations who control the code, control the data, and so on. And we need a business model where we actually fund properly the development of open science and its software, and I'm wondering whether anyone has got a vision as to how to do that, because that's absolutely what we need to do, unless we're going to go through the same cycle of people owning our data and software as we see at the moment.
Wow. Go on, Cheryl.
It's a technical question.
That's a technical question, is it? Andy, go on. So on the institutional question, I think what's happened in Australia, I'm not sure where you are anyway, I guess. What's happened in Australia is that when we first probably launched into e-research, there were a few institutions who got it, mostly in computing, and there were a very large number of institutions where it wasn't mainstream an issue. Right? I think that's not true anymore. And I think it's because the data and information and compute needs of researchers is rising as the volumes of data go up. And that creates expertise problems. So I think we now live in a world where what we've built as national infrastructure may not match the investment that might be going on in institutions, and in our planning process we kind of need to close that gap. So I think that's where the institutions play a role. I think, as they pointed out a long time ago, if you add up what we spend and you add up what you spend, there's a problem if we don't work it out. One of us is wasting a lot of money, and it could be you. So I think that's, and it could be. So I think that's a key issue. And what I like about our current model is that unless the institutions want what's happening, it's really hard for it to happen. On the other hand, the Commonwealth has funds that says, well, this is actually national. And so the 2 points of view have to meet. And that's a really good requirement, because it's really easy to build back-end stuff that in fact they don't come to. It's really easy to do. So I think that's, I mean, ETH dollars are hard to use, but that particular aspect is really powerful for us. We have to have that matching of agreement. I think you're right, institutions are inherently competitive, and they need to be. And this creates a really big problem for data management. And so what we've done is we've invited the institutions to arrive at some cooperative solutions. We're in the process of reviewing that, so we probably can't go into the details, but they have. And I think it's a great step forward for us. On the software, Andy.
So we're lucky in climate science because we're following the path that particle physicists or astronomers have followed. There isn't, at the moment, commercial value in most of the codes that we work with, and therefore, because you can't simulate a piece of the climate, you can't, for instance, worry about how climate will be over Melbourne without fitting that into the global picture, and because no country now has the capacity to do that in isolation, the scale of the problem forces international collaboration. And because of that, our codes tend to be open and shared. We're following the particle physicists' model more than the chemists or the bioinformatics model. So your problem isn't actually, is there a model you can use? Your problem is getting out of the model that you found yourself in and moving much more into a science-driven paradigm. And I have no idea how you get out of that. What we're doing in the climate sciences is not getting into that model in the first place. We're fortunate because the amount of money that flows into climate is negligible, despite rumours you may have read on the internet. The problem we come up with is weather forecasting, which has commercial value. It has national strategic value, and our codes that we use are very similar to the weather forecasting community, if not identical, and we do have a problem there, but we're trying to resolve it.
Oh, look, I just had one other comment on the institutional competitive versus collaborative sort of reflex, and that is that the way that the infrastructure, the e-research infrastructure is being built out in Australia has depended on bringing institutions into a consciously collaborative role. It hasn't been straightforward, but it's happening. And one of the things, curiously, that is actually coming to our aid, I think, as a country, and in other ways it hasn't in the past, is the existence of the states. Because in some of the cases, state-based consortia or state co-funding becomes part of the picture. And although it's not always easy to align the precise objectives of the Commonwealth and any given state government around this stuff, it nevertheless produces a leveraging effect, which I think we're seeing the evidence of some of the positives for playing out now.
I'm Billy Landon. I'm just John Morrissey from CSIRO. We've heard various talks, plenary speaking talks about the long tail of data. What I'm curious about here is we're seeing lots of large investments in bright, shiny exabyte computing and things like that. Aren't we sort of heading towards almost like the mining industry, a two-speed economy in science, where a lot of the smaller sciences and things like that aren't getting a fair go at the system? And I suppose one of the opportunities we miss with this is, the reason that people keep throwing ropes over trees every time Andy turns up is because he talks about a problem, with climate and how it's all getting hotter and all that sort of stuff. But people actually want to see how that is going to affect them, how they're going to cope with climate. So that means having to bring in data from a whole pile of other disciplines and to actually tell people how you actually give them a solution to a problem. So I want to sort of hear what your views are on sort of how we actually, we've got the stuff on the left-hand side, which is all the really big science, big data, but how are we going to actually sort of make sure the tail doesn't get ignored?
Thanks for that, John. Good question. So the answer to that, I think, is within the roadmap. I could stop there and ask you to read the roadmap. However, I won't. So we are aware, of course, that in terms of our investments, it might appear as if there's been a focus on some of the big scientific questions for the future, and in fact, there have been some investments in that space that seem to indicate that. However, in terms of the last three roadmaps, I think we've been very clear about the need for research infrastructure to support all areas of research. And that includes such things that have been developed under the SubScience Initiative, such as the Australian Urban Research Infrastructure Network, which is a capability around the built environments, and is a capability that does in fact come to that question partly of how do people come to understand the issues of climate change and how climate change might impact on them. So the built environment's capability is sometimes touted as a social science capability because it is about looking at the behaviors and the impacts on people of how we actually create and form our built environments in response to some of these bigger questions of climate change and so on. And that's an example of a new capability under the Science Initiative where we are actually going into what you may perceive as a tail end of the entire spectrum of science. But we do see it as a very important area of science that we do need to address.
So I'm sure some of the answers are in the roadmap, but what I try to emphasize is people are the critical resource in resolving those sorts of problems. And I was party to a conversation not long ago where one person was arguing for their institution to provide petascale storage and the other person didn't know what a peta was and just wanted somewhere to archive their Excel file. And where to archive, and I mean archive, I don't mean put on a CD, where to archive their Excel file was just as big a challenge for them as where to put a petabyte might be for me. My son is 11, he's getting better IT training than most science students at most institutions I know, which perhaps is a positive for the long term, but there's going to be a big gap if we don't do something about all of the up-and-coming future researchers that are in between. So I think the way you assess the tail is you make damn sure that the kids coming through higher education have the appropriate level of IT skills. And that doesn't mean they have to learn Python, but it means they have to be aware of the challenges that are going to confront them in the workplace and in the research careers that they might strive to. And if that isn't taught to them and they don't engage in that, then we will be sitting here in 10 years' time having missed a very major opportunity.
Thanks for those. Thanks for those answers. I think, John, just to add to that myself, many times scientific solutions have failed to be taken up as well as they might have because we as a community have failed to understand the implications and the social implications of those policies, and I think the same is in fact true. I think the things that Andy was talking about earlier about training of people and actually leveraging the 7-year funding for the ARC Centre of Excellence for Climate Change is a really good example of how this kind of thing can work, because none of these solutions are going to be worked out in the very short term. Now, I'm conscious of the fact that we have to move on to another activity. Is there another question that someone wants to ask that's quite burning? The questions so far have been profound and have taken quite a while to answer. Has anyone got a quick and dirty question that they'd like to ask? Yes.
Whose job is it to make sure that RDSI and NECTA and AAS and all the other and etc. work together?
I'd just say the government's job, but actually it's a collective.
I'll take that away from you.
It's a collective responsibility, and of course one of the functions of the Research Infrastructure Council is to consciously talk about the issues that come up, about the extent to which these things are fitting together or not, what's observable in terms of community feedback about how coherent it looks, and therefore what some of the planning should be in the future in terms of the advice that the government both solicits and seeks further elaboration on, which is really what happens in that council.
Sorry, Tom. Well, actually, the government will be trying to promote that better integration and coordination between our investments, and it is, I think, for me, the overriding aspect of the new e-research chapter in the 2011 roadmap that need to actually look across the spectrum of the investments that we are making and make the connections between those investments. But really, it is also the responsibility of the individual investments to actually reach out to each other and make those connections among themselves. And some of them are doing that really quite well. But we can improve the way we're doing it, and we can do it across the board. And it's not only the connections between the different national investments that we make, but also the connections into some of the state-based and institutional investments that are being made, which are really key to how that national fabric works. And some of the work that we're doing in this at the moment is a project around communications to try and improve the communications of the individual projects, and also to raise the communications of those projects to a broader level where people can see what they're contributing to at the broader spectrum of research in Australia.
So I have a slightly more challenging answer. So I think this is exactly why we need to have supported institutions. Really the coalface, I think as the IT director said to us a couple of years ago, well, if you succeed, you're going to be overwhelmed. Right? You're going to be overwhelmed. Where's the help desk? Where's the support? How does it happen? I think it's really good that, you're an e-research director. Well, I think this is the shift. We need to understand how to deliver into research groups. I think the back end is, as a development investment, it's right that each particular function has a head. Otherwise, we wouldn't get them all. But as we go to a more operational delivery mode, we kind of need to sort out these issues. And I think, as an e-research director, you have a key role in helping us understand how to do that. Okay?
One of the challenges as an e-research director I face is I've just written my NECTA bid, which is going to the next file, assuming they will interface to RDSI without really knowing any kind of details. And so if you really want these things to come together and cohere and tell a very unified story, there should be. Right now I can't.
So without being utterly defensive, right? They were originally connected together, and then how we were going to do it, the sector, said we don't want it done that way. And we had to change our minds. And so there is a complexity going on that was not originally intended. Yep.
I have a last question somewhere over here.
Oh.
Curious if there's going to be any explicit international networking activity, such as you see in the European Framework Program, whatever it's called now, there's one in the US as well. And given the desire to have international collaboration, having a mechanism for doing that rather than just relying on in-kind support seems to be a preferable way to go. Is that planned, desirable?
Yes, it's desirable. At the moment, the fund source prohibits the Commonwealth funding that out of the funding that's going into the infrastructure. There are other international engagement programs the departments run, but every one of our projects is deeply engaged internationally. I think Ross keeps travelling to Europe because they keep inviting him over to talk. But I think you're right, there's a deeper planning issue on global science and research infrastructure, which we kind of need to fund.
I am going to call questions to a halt there because it's now time to invite Paul Sherlock up onto the stage. I think we're going to make an announcement.
Hello again. It's actually a co-announcement that we would like to make. And this relates to the department's wish to launch a James Tizard Memorial Prize in tribute to the project director for our National Research Networks project under the SuperScience Initiative, who unfortunately passed away in August this year. And I'd like to say a few words about James now, if I can. Then I'll pass it on to Paul, who actually has known him for many years and has worked with him fairly closely over the last little while. So, it's sort of a sad duty on my part, but really I hope that you know, the idea of having a memorial prize in tribute to James and all of the work that he did for the research sector and the education sector in the past around the use of ICTs is something that James would be quite happy about, because he is and has been always interested in the future of the research and education sectors in relation to, you know, being able to use the capability that your research can provide for the outcomes of research, as well as in the past for education. So, on behalf of the department, I'd like to announce this James Tazard Memorial Prize, which is in fact a small prize aimed at teasing out from researchers excellent examples of how e-research infrastructure has assisted in advancing their research. And the details for the prize and the criteria for the prize are all available on the website. The URL is there, and it's on the conference website, and there'll be a link to the conference website, presumably from the homepage of the conference website, that will be able to, you know, invite you to respond to this. So the department has worked with James Tazard for some time, most recently as the project director for the National Research Networks project under the SuperScience Initiative, as I mentioned. I personally met James for the first time in around 2003 or 2004, when he was the director for the South Australian Department of Further Education, Employment, Science and Technology. And at the time, I was coordinating what was called a community of practice on e-democracy as part of my work with the Australian Government Information Management Office. And James's department kindly offered to host one of our meetings of that community of practice. And at the start of the meeting, he came over to talk about the South Australian government's work in online citizen engagement, which at the time in 2003 was a relatively new thing. And I have to say, at that first encounter with James, he came across as, you know, very senior and quite sober and serious. But also, what really struck me straight away, and Danny in my team, who was also there at the Community of Practice Day, might also agree when I say that, you know, he came across as quite passionate about, you know, the role that the web had to enable that closer engagement with citizens. And that was my first impression of James. And of course, James was a public servant at the time. And it was some time before I saw James again, actually. And it has really been more recently that I've come to know him a bit better when I took over the management of the e-research area in the department. And James, as the director of our SuperScience National Research Network project, brought the level of engagement and an ability to draw out collaborative behaviors. And this was partly done through his passion that helped to push our intentions for research networks into the future. And he did this in a friendly and open and non-threatening way that was really quite conducive to the collaborative behaviors that we really like to foster in the national space around, you know, the development of research infrastructure. And my last impression of James is that, you know, he brought a kind of earnest approach to his work. You know, the kind of earnest approach that appeared to demonstrate a really genuine and true interest in, you know, the kinds of things he was doing. So really on behalf of the department, I'd like to say thank you to James for all his work and efforts, you know, in our space over the last little while. On behalf of myself and Kate Herford in my team, who did work really closely with him over the last 18 months or so, Claire McLaughlin, my branch head, and Anne-Marie Lansdowne, the head of division in my area, for the vision and the passion that James brought to his work. And I would now like to ask Paul Sherlock, who is the University of South Australia's representative in relation to the National Research Networks project, and who knew James very well, to talk a little bit further about James. Thank you.
Thanks, Cheryl. James was a great friend and colleague, and I consider myself lucky to have been able to work with him closely for the last 8 years. He was passionate about computing and, as you've heard Cheryl say, particularly about the networking aspects, but he was also passionate about e-research, even in the early days when people were struggling to get come to grips with it. In the last few weeks of his life, James and I spoke a fair bit about what he'd achieved in his professional and personal life, and he was most proud of what he'd achieved as CEO of SabreNet, and it was his drive and energy that saw SabreNet established within a very short period, in fact, within 12 months, and it was his vision and, as Cheryl was talking about, his ability to work collaboratively and in that case establishing quite a unique private-public partnership with AMCOM, which resulted in our researchers in South Australia having access to one of the most cost-effective fibre networks in the world. James was also very proud of the work he was doing quite recently as the project director for the National Research Network, and in fact, really he was single-handedly driving that project with the help of the steering committee, of which Nick down the front is the chair. And before that, he was the interim executive director of eResearch SA, so he made a broad contribution. James was a rare breed in that he was a strategic thinker, but also a doer and an achiever, and his affable manner allowed him to cut through what were often difficult situations or things he found himself in. And I think he will be remembered, and he would want to be remembered, I think, by those who knew him as someone who made good things happen. So on behalf of James' family and his colleagues and friends in South Australia and beyond, I'd like to thank you, Cheryl and Dizza, for establishing this prize in James's honour. James loved working with you guys, and wherever he is now, I'm sure the thought of this prize would put a smile on his face. And my hope would be that whoever benefits from this prize, that they are inspired by what James achieved, and that they, in the context of eResearch, similarly go on to make good things happen. So thank you.
With that moving little section, I think it's appropriate to wrap up our forum for today. I'd like to express my thanks to all of you for your participation. I'd like to thank the Department of Innovation for sponsoring this forum. I'd like you to join with me in once again thanking our 4 speakers for the day for what I thought were 4 really good talks